the video here so we can have the recording for those that weren't able to make it. All right, cool. Let me start sharing the screen too. Or well, let's hold off on that for just a second. Okay, so yeah, it sounds like I wasn't totally on mute there for a second. So you guys might have heard some of the intro here I was going through, but basically welcome. Thanks for joining this workshop. This is hopefully the first of, I would say at least probably 3 or 4 that I want to go through on kind of writing clean code. Sorry, I'm Jason McCreary. If you guys aren't familiar with me, I go by JMac. It's just a nice little mashup of the name, and I tend to work with a bunch of other Jasons for some reason. It's never failed. Every team I've ever worked on, there's been at least one other Jason, if not 2 other Jasons, even on teams of like 10 people. So I've acquired the nickname JMac. I've also been programming for the last 20 years. And, kind of during that time, just like we all like to do, I really look to kind of improve my code. And, there's all sorts of things out there and all sorts of different ways people tell us to kind of write code, do this, do that, use these patterns, use these conventions. And, some of these things work and some of these things don't. And really what I've found to be kind of the thing that works is really finding truth in the statement of that we read code far more than we write code, right? And that's something that I picked up from the book Implementation Patterns by Kent Beck. It's a really good book. It's pretty dense, but it's only about 130 pages, and they go through a lot of little patterns that you can do inside of your code. But in one of the early chapters, he kind of talks about the motivation for writing, readable code, right? Writing, clean code, and really that's what we're talking about when we use the words, clean, uncluttered, anything like that, or code that communicates, right? That's really what we're talking about is code that's easy to kind of read, and therefore it's easy to understand. And if it's easy to understand code, it's going to be easier to kind of maintain and work with that code. And that's what's really important, right? Especially for me is like someone who's had to learn a bunch of new code bases over the years with all these different jobs and just kind of the years of experience, is that I like to see kind of these common elements inside of code. And so I've put these into kind of a set of practices, and we're going to go over the really basic ones today. So we're going to try to cover 3 of them. This was actually an article that I wrote a couple weeks back, and it got a lot of traffic. And so I thought, okay, well, let's turn this into a workshop and kind of go behind the scenes on that post, because the post kind of gave you the top 3 and it kind of showed you the before and after code. But let's go through kind of the nuances of getting there, right? Because I think that's what's really important, right? What's really important is focusing on code that's readable. And I found that when I did that, my code was like dramatically better. I was changing it less often. That's something we do as developers a lot, right? We jump in there and kind of make the code our own in a way. But I found once I kind of wrote this cleaner code or this more readable code, I wasn't doing that. Even when it was my own code or someone else's, I wasn't changing it as much. I also found, again, more importantly, that I could kind of look at the code and it had a certain level of consistency, so I wasn't getting like distracted with all these other noisy things, right? So let's start looking at code. That's really the it for me. So let me share the screen again here. And what I'm going to demo is basically this set of PHP code, right? And this code specifically it's real world code. I pulled it from a project a couple weeks ago that I came across, and this is exactly how it looked. And I had to work with this code, and there were some issues for me, right? Like right away, to me, it didn't feel readable. And this is common code. There's nothing wrong with this code per se. Clearly, it runs and it works. It was doing its job in this project, but it just, there were dirty bits about it, right? So we're basically gonna go through this code, and if not everyone's a PHP developer, hopefully this code kind of has that basic C-style structure that everyone can kind of follow. So don't worry too much if you're not a PHP developer. We're not going to get too deep into PHP functions or anything native to the language. Again, hopefully this code is basic enough in nature to kind of adopt and apply these practices to whatever it is you write primarily. So, but we're going to stick with PHP, but I'll make some references to kind of code in general as well. So let me make sure I'm hitting all my highlights here. I got another monitor off to the side here that I'm I'm having my cheat sheet for here. So, but basically, yeah, if we take a look at this code, again, at a really high level, we can tell what it's doing, right? So we can see that it's doing some kind of check, right? Obviously, right away from the function name. And it seems to be doing something with kind of the user and their permissions, maybe, right? We can kind of reason about it at a really high level. And on top of that, we can also kind of quickly see from these return statements that it's some kind of Boolean function, right? It's going to return true or false. But if we really wanted to get into kind of like the flow and we needed to figure out if someone asked us, hey, something's wrong with public, that check function doesn't seem to work sometimes with certain users. And we actually had to get into this code. The flow is a little hard to look at, right? I mean, this whole switch block down here is like kind of really intimidating, right? Like something about it seems, a little nasty, right? It seems a little unclean. And again, all written code like this, so don't feel bad. I've written code like this plenty of times. I still do sometimes, but then I'll go back and apply these practices. So, very first practice is let's adopt a coding style. This is a holy war for some people. It's a hot topic, right? Tabs versus spaces and so forth. And to be honest, I'm more of a tabs guy. But really, what matters more to me these days is the fact that the code is formatted, right? And I think you have to make that judgment call. You have to say, look, maybe I like tabs over spaces, or maybe I like spaces over tabs, or maybe I like curly braces on this line, or whatever. But if you're kind of nitpicking those types of things, you're really not focused on the code anymore, right? And that's really what I decided mattered more to me. It mattered more to me that the code was formatted in a consistent way that made it more readable to me than it did that I was using tabs or spaces. And again, things like that are all configurable, but it's where people jump right away. They jump to curly brace placement and indentation types, and it's kind of noisy, right? And that's the whole thing we're trying to get rid of. Let's just drop all that noise and adopt one. And I think once you can make the decision that the code readability, right, and the code format, code readability is greater than the specifics of the format, then life gets a little easier, right? And that argument starts to become a little silly, and we can kind of let it go. So with that said, in any editor, you probably have an option to automatically format your code. So this is a super simple thing to do. Why aren't we doing it, right? And it's because we're fighting about the details, right? We're swatting at the bees while the bear is killing us. So I'm using PHP Storm. It's a great editor, but any other editor has plugins. For example, Atom has Beautifier, so does Sublime. There's plugins for Vim. It doesn't matter what you're using. There's ways to automatically format your code. So for example, if I just do Command-Option-L right here, I automatically have PHP Storm format these 20 lines, right? And immediately upon doing that, we can see that flow and that structure kind of take shape immediately, right? That switch statement, while it's still a little dense, we can see its inner flow a lot better than we did before. We can see that it's, underneath this else, right? Whereas before it was kind of top level because the indentation was broken. So it's just something very immediate that you can do, right? So whatever editor you're in, again, if you're happening to be using a PHP Storm, you can do Command-Option-L or Control-Option-L on Windows, and it should automatically format that to you. Now, what standard is this formatting it to? Well, in this case, PHP Storm, it's using PSR3, which is one of the common standards that's adopted in the PHP community. There's other standards that you can use. You can jump into PHP Storm, for example, and configure this. Again, I try not to go too far with those types of things. I really want to make sure that I'm staying in something that's easily adaptable. So, for example, if other members of your team are not using PHP Storm, they might not be able to configure it in the same way as you, or you might not be able to share your formatting configuration with them as easy, right? So the other thing is I changed this one file, right? But what if I wanted to do this with all the files in my project or whatever? That might be a little silly, to go into each file and be kind of running the shortcut key. Or going up to the menu options and doing it kind of by folder or whatever. So while you can apply sweeping changes in certain editors, What I really like to find is a tool that's just going to do all this for me automatically. So let me undo this real quick just to kind of prove where we were in the world. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to jump out to the command line to just kind of demonstrate. So again, I'm in this same place where I can see this before PHP file that we're using. And what I like to use in PHP specifically, and again, other languages have this option. They have linters or auto formatters, and some languages even have this built into core. For example, like Go and Python. But in PHP, there's PHP Code Sniffer. And if we just take a look at that, I already have it installed, but I just want to make sure you guys can kind of see it. So, but basically what this is it basically goes in, it sniffs out your code and compares them against a certain coding standard or coding style. So I have this installed via Composer globally, which is basically outlined here. If you're not familiar with Composer or PHP, that's basically PHP's package manager. So it's very similar to like NPM or Gem in Ruby. So if you're familiar with those, same concept with PHP Composer here. So I've already gotten it installed. So I'm just going to run PHP CS, and I'm going to use the standard of PSR2, and I'm going to check it against the before PHP file. And again, there's a lot of different standards inside of PHP. You can supply other things there. I just happen to use PSR2 because, again, it's adopted by kind of the code bases that I use and the frameworks that I use. So when I run this, we'll see that it kind of immediately reports on syntax errors or coding style errors that I have that violate kind of the rules, right? And if we look, it talks about how the opening brace should be on a new line and all these types of things. What I really want to note, though, about this tool is not only that it kind of reports out the indentation and all these little nuanced things, but it also recently, in the last few years, they've really beefed up what they call their beautifier, which will basically fix these violations automatically. And that's what I care about. So let me clear this screen here so you guys can see all this. So if I do PHP CBF, the code beautifier, and I basically run the same command, I can beautify code to this standard. And when I run this, it's going to fix a total of 23 errors, all the errors that it found. And in fact, if I just up arrow back to that PHP CS and run this again, we see that there are no errors anymore. So it fixed everything that it reported on. That's not always going to be the case, but again, great tool. It's automated and it can be run across, an entire directory. Like I can run it across everything in here, or, all PHP files. This is something that can be automated. And that's what I care about, right? Again, what's more important than the standard is that it's something that can be automated, not just by you, but your continuous deployment tools, your continuous integration tools, other members of your team, outside vendors. That way it's very easy, and it's just not something I have to think about for other people to even mess with, right? So let's go back to our editor, and we'll see again, just as earlier as I did, formatted it in PHP Storm, we see that we get a similar formatting, but it was done automatically by, this tool. Again, there's all sorts of them out there. I can see some people posting in Slack some other tools. There's services out there. I don't care at the end of the day how it's done. I just want it to be something that's automated and something that's consistent, right? I can't use a certain code style and have another developer on the team use another. As we continue to work on each other's files and changes, again, I'm spending all my time going back in there and like moving certain things around to get it to my format. And that's just a waste of time, right? That's a waste of time. As developers, we really want to be focusing on the fact that, I'm working on the code. I'm not over here like, changing indentation levels for assigned statements, right? So if I have some bar and it's, 5, and I have X, I'll see people that spend all their time like making sure that these, equal signs in the assignment line up. And I can understand there's an argument there for readability, but again, to me, it boils down to that's just not what I want to spend my time on. I want to spend my time on writing code. So that is step 1. That's code formatting, right? So very easy. Find a tool that's automated and just help you kind of reason about the code easier. If nothing else, make it consistent. And again, I don't agree with everything in here. I don't necessarily like some of these curly brace placements. I'm more, I like to have them on the same line up here. But I'm willing to give that up for consistency, right? So let's move on. The next piece here is let's talk about naming things. So there's a great quote in computer science that's been around for decades, but basically it states that there are two hard things in computer science or in programming, and it's invalidating the cache and naming things, right? And it's true, naming things are like really hard. There's no kind of set rule, and we're always surrounded by certain syntactical things that we don't have to worry about naming, like these if statements and returns, switch. We have a very set grammar inside of a language, so in a way that kind of hurts our vocabulary because we end up naming things like really computer-esque, or we name things really shorthand, like I did just a second ago with like variable names of X, and these, they don't help with readability, right? The compiler doesn't care, or the interpreter doesn't care. It's just going to, take that assignment, and the syntax is good, and it's going to keep going. But as someone who comes back and reads your code later and wants to work on it again, there are better clues that I can leave by naming things a little more properly, right? Taking the time and the care to kind of come up with better names. And again, it's really hard because there's kind of no set rule. Just like a coding standard, it's something that you kind of have to adopt as a team or adopt as a developer to kind of use this consistent naming. So let's start taking a look at some of these names inside of here, right? Okay, so first of all, let's kind of set a rule. And I think most developers, most programmers are going to agree with this rule. Even though it's going to kill keystroke savings, don't use abbreviations, right? I don't know exactly what you abbreviated there. I don't know if that's an acronym or an initialism that stands for something. I don't know if that's just a shorthand of a more proper variable name. I don't really know in the future, and maybe given the context of what's going on here, I might be able to figure that out, or I might be able to phonetically sound it out. SCP, skip, So okay, maybe this is the scope. But really, in the beginning, what was the need to kind of shorthand that, right? We have all these powerful editors and autocomplete and ways to kind of sweepingly rename variables. It's just so silly to do abbreviations these days. In my opinion, there's really no such thing as a long variable name, provided that it's relaying context. And we'll kind of dissect that statement here. But first of all, let's just stop abbreviating here. Let's name this kind of its real thing, right? So avoid abbreviations is kind of the first thing. And I'm just using the variable rename refactor inside of PHP Storm to kind of help me rename both of those. You guys could use a search and replace or something if you don't have that type of editor. So that's the first thing is abbreviations. Again, just there's no reason in kind of the modern age to save on those bytes of variable names, right? Just name it out. This is called scope. We might even find a better name here in a minute, but let's start at least with not doing the abbreviation. Okay, so let's also talk about kind of the next thing, right? We're just going to keep going through these variables. ID. That makes total sense, right? We're all comfortable with an ID. It's an identifier. That's okay. There's an argument that this is an abbreviation, but I don't think you lose anything by saying ID versus identifier in this case. So again, as long as it's relaying the context, we can kind of make some exceptions to the abbreviation rule. So ID is pretty acceptable here, but this leads me to the next point about variable names. We really want them to relay context, right? We can infer contexts from other pieces of this code, right? From the name, what we're checking, and so forth. We can probably figure out what the ID is. We can infer it, but again, don't make me think, right? Like, just make it readable for me. I want to read it like a book. Like, check what has what scope, right? We're starting to get there, but if I knew a little bit more about what ID this was, that would be really helpful. So, for example, I know because I had to mess with this code that this is user ID, right? And now immediately by qualifying that variable name with a little bit more context, we know and can see like, okay, what this is, all right? So check that this user ID, has, this scope or something, maybe what this function would do if I was just reading kind of this signature right away. Okay, great. All right, so again, we see that this renamed everywhere. Okay, cool. So what other things what other conventions maybe do people follow about variable names that we might be able to talk about? Well, Some people like to do what's commonly referred to as Hungarian notation. This isn't actually Hungarian notation if you read about it, but what most people mean when they're talking about that is kind of adding context around the type of variable. So, for example, they might say something like str scope or string scope, right, to note that that variable contains a string. This is kind of a legacy thing people did in languages maybe that didn't have types, or in languages that maybe needed to infer that for very large code bases that couldn't be structured in better ways. Again, really early languages. Here, this again doesn't necessarily help. We're potentially providing more context, but there might be other things inside of the language that can relay that in a better way, right? And also actually provide additional value. So, for example, in PHP, I can actually now type hint in higher versions of PHP. I don't think I've configured the editor to recognize that yet, but I can say string here, or I can say int here, and actually relay that information through a type hint better than in the variable name. And that's actually going to provide me some real value outside of just the convention of a naming convention. It's actually going to make sure that is passed in as that type. So I get benefits by not putting it in the variable name is the point, and actually trying to leverage other functionality of the language. So again, it's rare that adding some kind of Hungarian notation or some kind of type context is actually going to improve upon the variable name that you've chosen. So I would tend to avoid those personally. That's kind of the next thing. So relay context, but not necessarily information that can be inferred in other ways, right? So from the ID, we couldn't necessarily infer user ID directly without being intimately familiar with the code. But once we have user ID, between ID and knowing what context the ID is, a user ID, we could pretty easily understand what a user ID is, right? Either by just knowing the user domain, knowing the database, all sorts of different ways that are a little more readily available than having to understand what this entire function does. So subtle difference there, but important. Another piece of that too is actually there are times when kind of adding some additional higher level data matters. So let's look at one more thing here. Let's say I had something like a coordinate, right? And this is just like a three-dimensional coordinate. And so I have, X, Y, and Z. So coordinates fine. That relays pretty good information. And I think a lot of people would feel that that's a good variable name, right? But it's telling me kind of what it is and not necessarily how it is or who it is. Some of those other things, some of those other questions you might ask yourself. So there's an argument to be made that if I said something here like center, that could tell me a little more context about what that coordinate actually is. But now, without having something else over here, I'm not exactly sure, what center is. I've kind of lost some information that kind of hinted at its type, right? It doesn't have a formal type over here. It's kind of just this array. So I think there's an argument to be made that you could say center, coordinate. You could leave that, or you could even say something a little more mathematical, like center point. And I think we could agree that that's better than the original, right? And again, we've done things like try to relay context about, how it is, how it might be used. Who it is and how it might be used, as well as information about kind of what it is. So, and I think those are two important things, right? Answer those questions, who, how, what. If you can accomplish that with a variable name while still being concise, then that's great. That kind of leads me to the next point and the last point kind of on variable naming. You really want to hunt for a good variable name, right? And this is a little bit difficult. And DHH, the creator of Ruby on Rails, actually made a really good post on this. I'll put it in the notes once we're done with the workshop. But this is actually like a really interesting kind of process that you have to go through. And I'll admit it's a little time consuming the first few times you do it. But what's really nice is you help yourself kind of build that vocabulary, right? You end up figuring out these common words that you can use. And again, as programmers, we kind of solve the same problems over and over and again. So once you put kind of this vocabulary, once you have like this word bank, you'll find that you don't spend a whole lot of time naming things anymore because you kind of just use them a lot. So here's a really good example. How many times have we all kind of done something where a certain object or a certain piece of information like needed an order, right? Like it had kind of a placement in a greater list, right? And so a lot of the times in our database, we'll put an order field, right? And this thing's the first, and this thing's the second, right? Um, but there's a problem with that, right? And I'm sure, as I said, database, some of you might have been thinking, but the issue is there's reserved words here, right? So order, for example, is a reserved word in SQL. So over the years, I've kind of changed that to be, sort order, right? So that's a little bit better, right? But if we continue that hunt, right? If we continue that, there might be even better words here. For example, rank might relay more of what I'm after. Maybe that's really what it is. So instead of what order it came in, maybe rank is a little more appropriate in that context, right? There's other names like position. If we're talking about something in a list, that can come across a lot nicer. There's one that I really like. It's a little fancy, I'll admit, but it's ordinal. And if we just jump out and take a look here, if we define ordinal, I'll blow this up a little bit, but basically, what I really like here is things position in a series. So again, it's that hunt for that word. And it might take a little time. The first time you might have to get out on thesaurus.com or whatever and kind of put your base word in there, the word that you have, and kind of start working through it, right? But it's one of those things that once you have this, it's something you'll end up using a lot. So I think ordinal, again, is a pretty cool one. And it really relays, in fact, now that I've stumbled upon this, better than order. Like the order is the whole thing, right? It's the whole range, right? Whereas ordinal is a little bit better definition. It's actually the position in the whole thing. So I think that's kind of a nice one. So again, all sorts of alternatives to sort order or order if you're finding yourself using those a lot. While these are pretty common, again, just that subtle difference in hunting for that better name can actually really give you something that relays that context just a bit more. So with all of that said, naming things is one of those areas we can definitely get stuck on, right? So a lot of the times when I'm coding something, I will actually start out with just some kind of, temporary variable. And I'll even be a little silly sometimes and be like, I don't, know what to call this. And, just to keep myself moving, because I don't want to get stuck on the word right away. If you do that, you're really creating like mental roadblocks for yourself. Just write the code, keep going, and then you can come back and rename this later with your fancy editor tools once you have more context. Because likely after you finish writing all of that code, you're going to be in a place where you're intimately familiar with the code, and you want to take just those few minutes to kind of go back and see if you can tweak these variable names to help that next reader, right? And that next reader might even be you, but it's going to be you 6 months from now after you've written 1,000 other lines of code, and you're going to forget it all. So, don't get stuck. Go back but do go back and fix that real quick. Okay. So you guys have all probably heard, the naming things and format your code and everything. Hopefully I've convinced you a little bit. Let's get on to the meat a little bit more, where we actually start changing kind of the structure of this code, right? So what I want to focus on today, and we're going to focus on more things as we go on with this code sample and with more code samples. But I think the biggest thing today, regardless of how you program in, regardless of what language, is we can really talk next about kind of conditionals and flow control. And really what I'm after here is avoiding nested code. And this is a big mess. And there's all sorts of measurements out there. There's something called cyclomatic complexity. It's very difficult to say, and I think PHP Storm can actually calculate it if I wanted to take a second and run it, but we won't do that. But the point is it basically measures kind of the layers of depth that your code go. And we can see here that we kind of have a lot of nesting going on. We have, I would say, at least 3 layers here, arguably 4. We also have a lot of breakpoints in the code based on that flow. We have a lot of places where we see returns everywhere. It would be difficult to go through this code and map out all the places that it came back. or sorry, all the places that it returned, how it returned, all kind of the flow paths, right? If we were making that diagram, we'd have a lot of branches. So what can we do to kind of clean this up, right? Well, let me take a step back for a second. What I want to say here is basically that these rules, while helpful and you should pay attention to them, avoid things that are really hard about their numbers, right? So some people will say things like, oh, you should only have one return statement. I don't really agree with that. Or, oh, your code should never indent more than one level. So those are those hard numbers. And I tend to be leery of those. I don't necessarily strive to write code exactly that way. I just strive to write code that's a little more clean, right? So let's talk. Let's go back to talking about how this could be clean. Got like a little nose itch there. Sorry. Okay, so first of all, what I don't like here is basically this nesting. And so a lot of the times when I see pairings of if and else as well as switch, when I see multiple types of flow control or multiple types of conditionals, I want to see if there's a way to remove those. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with this code with there. So this switch statement, while switches are awesome, and I do use them, since it's not necessarily top level, and it only really has kind of these two paths, I want to translate that back to an if, because basically at the end of the day, a switch is really just a construct for a set of if statements. So let's start by switching that back. No pun intended there. So I'm just going to write this code above here. So basically, I'm going to say, look, if scope is equal to public, then I basically want to get this return. So I'm going to bring that up, and that would allow me to kill all of this switch. So again, I'm kind of removing some extra code there. We see the combination of returns and breaks, which are a little silly, by the way. So let me put that code back in real quick and make that point. Previously, this code was this way. We have a return true and then a break. The break is absolutely unnecessary. It's unnecessary because return's automatically going to relinquish control from this function. So there's no need to relinquish control from the switch statement itself. So I see this as a common mistake, especially as you kind of are starting out in development. You feel like the structure of case and break are always necessary because that's kind of the way you learn this control block. But when you introduce a return, you get some extra power there. So this break was never needed in the first place. We could have simply just removed that. But removing the whole thing actually ends up getting rid of multiple lines. So let's keep moving on our path here. So we can say else if, and we'll say the same thing. If scope is equal to private, then we're going to go inside of another block. And really, I'm just transcribing these exactly the same as before. So I can just fully take out this if statement. And now I'm in a situation where I can get rid of that private. And so now my switch just has a default of, okay, hey, look, jump in here and return false. But if we notice, and in fact, PHP Storm's kind of helping us here, there's really no reason to have that because both of these pieces of code do the same thing. So I know now that I can get rid of the full switch, including the default statement, which we didn't actually convert to an if statement, but we kind of got that for free from the return false. So this code is still a little dense. In fact, it's denser, in my opinion, with kind of these nested ifs. So let's keep kind of applying this logic, right? Anytime you see multiple ifs or multiple else, see if there's a way to pack that down, especially when the key indicator for me is I kind of have this if block, and then the only thing in that if block is another if block, right? I feel like I need one of those exhibit memes, but I know when I have that, I can basically condense both of those with a logical and. So now I can get rid of that inner if because that's ultimately what was happening, right? Those are the same conditions. You can draw a truth table those first few times to make sure that you're right. But basically, I can say, hey, look, if scope was private, and then if auth user was the user ID, return true, I can pack that together now and just say scope's private and the user ID matches the authorized user. So we've packed this down even more. But now the next thing I want to do is still continue to try to push on and avoid some of that nested complexity. So really, if we think about it, going back to those return statements, anytime you see return statements, you know that you've relinquished control, right? So let's build upon that a little bit more. So since I'm returning here, I know that if I ever got at this point in the code, if it ever executed line 6, it's never going to execute lines 8 through 14 anyways. So because of that, there's absolutely no reason to have this additional else, right? So I can kill it and end up having the same code. So right away, by doing that and then just running my format, I can actually break that out. And now I've removed another layer of nesting, right? So we've gone from 3 layers deep to 1 layer simply by kind of converting some switch statements back to ifs, because that's what was primarily being used in the first place, as well as leveraging the power of the return statement, right? And what this is called technically is a guard clause. And so what's happening is a lot of the times inside of the code, you have situations where you need to defend against certain types of things, certain input, right? Or you just want to return early. And again, some people are against this. I only want 1 return statement. I don't like return early, these types of things. Again, I try to avoid hard things. Sometimes it makes sense. Code's very dynamic. It's a very fluid thing. So if it makes sense here and makes the code more readable, then even better, right? So for example, if I'm someone as a developer, future developer, coming in here and looking at check, and I see, hey, if I'm an admin role, like just return true. And then I know I don't even have to read the rest of this code block, right? Maybe this is the most common case, right? Maybe it's an exceptional case. It doesn't really matter. The point is, if I can make that immediately readable, right, to a future developer, then if they're coming in here to see what admin does when I have a role admin, they can get right out of here and keep looking at their other stuff. So again, that's kind of this guard clause or this return early strategy. We can continue to apply that, right, and basically remove all of the else's in this case because of that, right? Because if we ever get inside of any one of these ifs, we're simply just going to return true. So I can get rid of that if, because again, if I got in here on line 10, I'm going to bail out of here with return true. And the only way I'm going to continue executing anyways is if that wasn't true. So there's no reason for the else. So now everything is nice and top level. So I can run the formatter just to make sure everything's good. Looks like I had some small spaces there. And that's it. So now we have everything top level. It's really just a series of simple if statements. Anybody arguably could kind of read that. Any developer at any level could come in here and say, oh, am I a user that has role admin? No. If scope's public, okay, go ahead and return true. If it's private, but I'm the kind of the owning user, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the future. But basically, if I'm the same user as the authenticated user, then I pass the check. Otherwise, the default case right away is false. So I know coming in here, if I ever had a weird scope or a null user or something of that nature, I can just immediately skip all these and look right at return false. I can see the default behavior of the check, which is to fail. Some people flip those on its head. They like to go in reverse. That's totally fine too. Whatever can help you kind of adopt that nesting, or avoid that nesting, whether you have to invert logic or collapse logic, or again, if you see if statements paired with return statements, definitely try to leverage those to remove a layer of nesting. So I think we're pretty good on time here. Good. Let me copy this, and let's just bring up the old and the new side by side again, which I'm sure if you guys are on the website, you probably saw this before. So let me just go back over here. And the easiest thing to do would basically just be to get checkout before.php. And we'll put that back. And let me just bring these up side by side. So let's split that vertically, shut that down. Cool. And there we have it. So I think hopefully, and we'll start this in the discussion here in just a second, but I think hopefully we can agree that what is on the right, the after PHP file versus what is on the left is far more readable. Not only is it technically speaking less code, it's also, its nesting blocks are gone. The variable names are a little more clear. It's cleanly formatted. It's consistently formatted. And it's just easier to read, right? There may be some adjustments we still do on this. We will actually continue to do more adjustments. There's ways you could pack down this logic some more. You could move these things around for kind of, if you're really interested in performance, what happens the most often. There's all sorts of other things you could do. Some people don't like the usage of the auth facade here. Where is that coming from, kind of thing. It's just one of those things where we'll keep looking at all that. But for today, based on the three things we said, formatting, variable names, and kind of removing nested code or adapting nested code, I think we've achieved that, right? And hopefully I'll jump into Slack and we'll see if we agree upon that. Cool. All right, so let's see. Let me jump over to questions. Looks like we got one in here. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to go ahead and open this up to questions. So feel free. I'm going to continue to share the screen and the video. If you kind of got what you needed, Slack will be available and open for the next, I would say, probably till the end of the day. But at some point, I will cut it for the next workshop because I kind of reuse this room. Continue to use it, chat today, share stuff. I'll share more resources later based on questions as well as some of the things I referenced in the video. But yeah, I'm glad to open it up for plenty of questions now. Like I said, we have a good 15 minutes, 20 minutes actually. So even more time to kind of be asking those questions. In the meantime, I'll just point out one more thing to let you guys kind of fill in some more questions. I'm seeing some come across, so that's good. So definitely, I'll be sending out an email for a future workshop. But if you guys have a really large code base, or you enjoyed this and kind of want to pair with me directly, I actually offer what I call coaching sessions, where we can basically go through your own code. We can apply some of these rules. We can level up some of your skills, or we can just tackle a big problem together. We use Screen Hero, where we can share screens, basically edit each other's, files just directly, both on the headsets, kind of going back and forth. So trust me, it's a great way to kind of level up your skills, be very productive, whatever you need. So these are out here. I'll post some links to these. But other than that, like I said, that's pretty much it for this workshop, the first of a few. So let's go back to questions. I'll post these links here shortly. Okay, so I'm going to start at the top, but feel free to keep them coming in. Okay, so what are some of the arguments against a guard clause? Okay, so yeah, good question. I kind of hinted at it a little bit, the fact that some people have these hard rules. They only want one return statement, right? So if I were doing this, these multiple returns, those people would kind of advocate, hey, you got a lot of places, you got a lot of control flow paths in here still where you're kind of returning things. So what they might want to see, and personally, I think this is a little bit dirty, but what they might want to see is basically some kind of return value here, or ret val. And I'm sure you've all seen this before, but maybe the ret val is default false. And instead of returning control flow here, they would basically set this to true here, and down here, and down here, and then they would return to have that one statement, right? And so that would be their argument, is like, I want one return. That's the argument. And this is what that code might look like. It's still unnested, but now we're having to track state, right? And state's a very difficult thing. That's the bane of programming, right? It's one of those things where it can make the code difficult to reason about, because as a human, I kind of have to keep track of, okay, what's the value of this thing? Where does it get changed? How does it get changed? When can it get changed? It's a lot of questions I have to answer. So for those reasons, I like the return statement, but I can't simply go through this code anymore now and say, auth user has role admin, they're going to set it to true. But because my eyes see additional places where this variable can be set, I still have to go through each one of them. So I'm not returning early. I'm not getting any benefits from that. I'm not getting the benefit of the guard clause, and know as a future reader to just quit reading the rest of this code, because I see ret value continually to be used, assigned, and referenced. So I got to be really careful in these scenarios. So for those reasons, I don't like it, but that's both sides of the coin, right? Some people have rules about they only want one return statement. And in small functions, that's probably something to strive for, right? But again, in normal sized methods, or methods that do very similar things with logical branching, I think having the return, leveraging return is there, it's available, and it keeps the code cleaner, in my opinion. So let's see what else we got. Okay, at what point do you say I'm going to write a new function to encapsulate some of this code? It's a good question. So I'm going to assume that you're kind of hinting at the possibility that we could take some of these inner pieces of this even and kind of break those out to continue to be even more readable is maybe what I'm going to assume you're kind of hinting at. I'll give you a chance to maybe give me a thumbs up on that. But basically, yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. I think that's a possibility, and that's actually something we're gonna go over in a future workshop, probably the next workshop. So it's one of those things where yes is the short answer for now. I'm going to leave it as a little bit of a teaser, but the point that's being made is some could argue that these types of things or these types of conditionals are a little more difficult to read, and at some point it might make sense to maybe encapsulate all of this in its own function, right? And we're going to talk about those extraction methods in the next thing, so I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But let's imagine that I had another function that was called isOwner, right? And we can kind of immediately, right, that readability, that cleanliness of a simple function like that, we can immediately read and kind of see what's going on there, right? If I am the owner of whatever this thing is that I'm checking, return true, like it's going to be fine. So we're going to look at those in the next workshop. So good little teaser there, but I'm going to delay you a little bit. Yeah, sorry. Okay, what's next here? What is the book you referred in the beginning? Yes, I'll post all of these references, but let me go ahead and bring it up for you guys. It's Kent Beck's Implementation Patterns. Implementation, there it is. I'll just show you the cover so you guys can have it kind of visually in your mind, but here it is. So again, it's out on Amazon, all sorts of places. I think if you're with Safari Books Online or any of those places, you can get a digital thing as part of your subscription. So it's freely available. Sorry, not freely available, but it's available widely on all those different platforms. But it's a great book. It goes through all sorts of little refactors that you can do. I'm going to, be drawing a lot of them from this book as well as others in these workshops to kind of give you the Cliff's notes or the JMac notes from all of these. But it's a great book. It's a little dense, but honestly, I've read it probably 3 or 4 times now over the years, and each time I pick something up out of it. But even the first few chapters, which are only about 20 pages, do a great job of really convincing you to just write this, just focus on writing this clean code. Don't worry about, the fancy, don't worry about design patterns so much. Just worry about how the code's like actually implemented or, actually used is another way to kind of say that. And he talks about that a lot, but great book. Implementation Patterns is what I referenced earlier. Okay, how do we refactor clean code without some tests covering it? Isn't that dangerous? Yes, very good point. We've kind of done all this by hand here, but the point that's being made, and this is an excellent point, and Michael Feathers, which is another great book that's out there. Let me go ahead and bring that up. Let's see, it's Michael Feathers' Legacy Code, I think. But yes, he has another book where basically in this whole book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, he basically states that legacy code is any code without tests. And he believes that you can't, he kind of argues in the beginning of this book that you basically can't change any kind of code. You can't do any kind of refactoring without tests. And I think that that's a true statement. And I think we need to be careful. We could have very easily introduced a bug trying to do some of these simple refactors. And while you may have thought I was doing it very methodically just for the workshop, where I was breaking out that switch statement into ifs, like line by line, I did that on purpose. That was actually how I changed the code when there aren't tests. So you want to be really careful. There's still a great possibility to introduce bugs without tests. And that's the point that's kind of being made in Slack, as well as by the author of that book, Michael Feathers. But basically, yeah, if you don't have tests and we can't run some unit tests, for example, against check to make sure that all the possible scenarios of scopes and user IDs didn't return and pass the way we thought they were, we might have introduced a bug. So it's very difficult to refactor code, I would say, or even to kind of write cleaner code without tests, or at least to do so confidently. It doesn't mean that you can't. Some of us don't have tests, and we're just going to have to do the best with what we got. But yes, I would definitely say if you had tests, you could do this with sweeping confidence, that all would be well in the world. So for today, we kind of did it meticulously, methodically. Formatting code, that should be very easy. I do want to point that out. So don't use no tests as a way to not format your code. That should be easy. The compiler or the linter or whatever is going to tell you, obviously, if a reformat has made your code syntactically incorrect. Variable names, that could be something a little less dangerous, but still dangerous. You could forget one place, of course. But yes, when you start moving around the control flow, definitely want those tests on your side. So, okay, let's see if there's any other questions I missed. I think the rest are kind of just statements. Is there a way to make it fewer ifs, ideally just one, all three are returning true? Yes. So a lot of people, especially on that post, were kind of talking about how I could condense this down. And let's just do it. We got a few minutes left here. Let's just do kind of what you're talking about here. So since this all is just kind of Boolean, like a return, we could just pack all of these down, use that same condensing kind of approach that I was doing earlier, where, we did all of this together, right? And then I just put a colon there, and now I can get rid of all this, because basically if you satisfy any one of these conditions, this or this and this together, hence the wrapping parentheses, that it's good. And if you didn't for some reason, then it's going to return false. You could do this. And, I think there were definitely some people on that side of the fence that were kind of leaving comments on the post. And I see this in a lot of code, and I'll do it myself every now and then. I would make the argument that there's an upper limit to this, right? This approach doesn't scale very well. And I think it really depends on very trivial things, unfortunately, like, line length, readability of code, how many conditions. And because it doesn't scale, again, because there's kind of no hard rules that kind of can be set, or things that would make it dangerous, I tend not to do this. So the argument I'm making is, I feel like this isn't as readable. If it was only, that, for example, then 100%, by all means, just simply pack it down and return that condition. That's a great small example of a refactor there that you can do. A lot of the times I've seen code where it's like, if this, return true, else return false. And it's like you can just return the condition and kind of get rid of the whole if-else structure. But when you have, this longer piece, I argue, we're getting on a slippery slope there. And so even though it's much, much more code, and I think there's opportunity to back it down, I would personally I'd rather read this, me. That's my opinion. We're welcome to kind of upvote or downvote that on Slack. But for now, this is probably where I would stop. And what I would do is introduce some of those additional helper functions or whatever to maybe encapsulate some of this logic and improve readability in other ways. And at that point, I might have an opportunity to come back and do what you're suggesting. But for now, for today, this is probably where I would stop. So yeah. Okay, cool. Any other questions in here? Let's see. I'll take just a few more minutes, at least 2 or 3 more minutes here. See if there's any more. I'll just kind of tinker around. Cool. All right. Doesn't seem like there's too much coming across. Okay, well, I'm going to stop it here then. And like I said, we'll definitely cover more advanced things. We're going to kind of build upon a lot of these in the next workshop. I plan to do that probably in I'd say 3 or 4 weeks. So I'm thinking maybe just kind of do one a month here for the next few months. But you'll probably see some blog posts come out between now and then if you're anxious for more. But yeah, today pretty basic, but hopefully it appealed to the full audience, and I wanted to make sure that everybody was kind of on the same page before we started tackling some of the deeper topics. So Feel free to send me a direct message with some of your feedback, good or bad. I'd love to hear it. I'm trying to kind of ramp up on these workshops more, so I'd appreciate your feedback. And like I said, I'll jump on the workshop channel and the questions channel here over the next hour or so and kind of share some of the resources and answer any stray questions that were left. But thank you all for coming out. And like I said, I will see you all next time, hopefully.